Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The love of a human is a reflection of the divine love, manifesting and manifested in us. Its universality knows no borders and no bounds. In this, it is as godly as anything. Love, reflecting, and reflection are all from the one who is best described as the divine is beautiful and loves beauty. Today's talk is, does a two-state solution suffice the three Israels? Defining the illusion of identities. An analysis of the inherent contradictions between the historical claims, biblical promises, and political/ideological objectives that define the three Israels, defying the logic of survival for both Israelis and Palestinians. I must share a disclaimer. This presentation is not my opinion, but an analysis of theses presented by others. On biblical reference, I rely on Christian sources. On matters related to Zionism, I rely on Jewish sources. I fill the gaps with summarized historical evidence in the forms of dates and data, maps and measures. I only draw logical conclusions, and I stand by my argument. The reference sources for my talk are as follows. An open letter to America's Christian Zionists from David P. Gushee and Glenn H. Stassen. Gushee is the Distinguished University Professor of Christian Ethics from Mercer University. And Stassen is Smedes Professor of Christian Ethics from the Fuller Theological Seminary. Because I do not consider myself a biblical scholar, I could easily go to the Bible and take certain verses and say, here it is. But I decided not even to do that. I tapped onto the works of two great Christian scholars, who are not just Christians as a matter of belief, but they are scholars who have every qualification in terms of how to interpret the Bible. So that will take the reference point as far as Christian thought and biblical references and their interpretation is concerned. And on Zionism, my sources primarily Benjamin Friedman, whose speech at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. in 1961, that is titled The Hidden Tyranny, was published in the early 1970s. Benjamin Friedman, a great American Jewish entrepreneur and businessman, pretty wealthy, but he was also well connected. Not only did he meet with the Kennedys, Joseph and John F. Kennedy, and was connected to prominent American politicians in the earlier part of the century, where the concept of Zionism permeated into the American politics. This man was also present in the Versailles Conference that decided the fate of Germany after World War I. He was present there in person. So therefore, he is an authority in more than one ways. He's a historian, a scholar, a businessman. He gets a lot of bad rap from of course, people who disagree with him, but I think his credentials are good in and of itself. I also have a secondary Jewish source, which I will keep as a surprise for the end of the lecture. So let's begin with, does a two-state solution suffice the three Israels? This title was given to the talk when I committed myself, but as I continued working, I realized that there are probably more than three Israels. The definition of Israel. So defining Israel, part one is the biblical Israel, the promised land. And here we go to, of course, the Bible, Genesis 15:18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. When you look at the geography that the Bible is talking about, we are talking about the territories of many countries. In this case, we can talk about modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, half of Iraq, half of Egypt, parts of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and perhaps even some of the Gulf states. So if we are making the assumption that God Almighty made a covenant with Abraham telling him, I'm giving you this land, we are not talking about the territory that is defined in the political sense as the boundaries of the state of Israel, but we are talking from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is quite a lot. If this was meant to be given to the descendants of Abraham, the way it was meant to be, there is no problem. But if this was meant to be given only to a certain group within, then there are two possibilities for that biblical prophecy to come to a conclusion. That would result in an Israel ruled by 90% majority Arabs, or that Israel has to attempt to subjugate that 90% by force. We go to Genesis 17:4. This is probably the pivotal text that God is saying to Abraham, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. That highlighted part is the key word here. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. We are talking about a plurality here. So many nations or multitudes of nations or many offsprings, or however you interpret this, we are not talking about a restrictive definition. And Gushi and Stassen are offering the opinion that close readers of Scripture will know that, in fact, Abraham did become the father of many nations. With Sarah, he became the father of Isaac and the ancestor of all in his line via Jacob and Esau. With Hagar, he became the father of Ishmael and all his line. And with the long-forgotten Keturah, according to Genesis 25:1, he became the father of Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shoah. So there we are talking about the plurality of nations to whom this land between the two rivers had been promised. But there's also a Christian interpretation, and here we go to St. Paul and the New Testament, another interpretation of that plurality. Here we go to Romans 4. Paul says that by faith, non-Jews become Abraham's descendants too. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe. Romans 4:11. Now, Europeans and Asians, Africans and Latin Americans, and any who believe in Jesus enter the line of Abraham. This is why It is correct to say that at least Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all descendants of Abraham, all part of the Abrahamic family tree, some by birth, some by lineage, some by faith. If we go to the New Testament, this is St. Paul, who is giving the descendants of Abraham a more spiritual interpretation rather than strictly genealogical one, which in my opinion would be more in line with the Quranic terminology of Al Ibrahim rather than Bani Ibrahim. Quran doesn't talk about Bani. It's not the descendants in the biological sense. But the Al Ibrahim implies the household, and the concept of the household, therefore, does not necessarily have to be biological. The house could be the house of a concept, and that concept is monotheism. And since we believe Abraham to be the father of monotheism, although I personally have questions about that, so in the context of the monotheism or Abrahamic monotheism, then as St. Paul interprets it, that then Christians and Muslims are also, and that this should not be restricted only to the Jews. The land that was promised, the promised land, was not promised in the context of exclusivity. That God did not say that I promise this land only to you and to no one else. There were people living there, and people have always lived between the Nile and the Euphrates. And there is no denial of that. And so if we have to understand that not only in the historical context, but also in the correct interpretation of how the Bible meant it to be, both in the Old and in the New Testament, is that this area that the Jews refer to, it had never been exclusively in the possession of any one tribe or any one nation. In the general context, I think most Middle Eastern states and societies are a mixed mosaic of ethnic, religious, tribal nations, for lack of a better term. In other words, the exclusivity is not a Middle Eastern concept, but a European concept. We'll come to that later. So we come to this argument that if the concept of the chosen people is based on what God promises Abraham to his progeny, then where does this other concept come from? Here is the Abrams family. So Abraham had Keturah with 7 children here, and Hagar, Ishmael, and 12 children down there. And then Isaac, and through Jacob, and then we have the 12 tribes here. But even in the case of Isaac, he had not only Jacob, but he also had Esau. So on the basis of what logic are we saying that God had promised Abraham that the land should be given not to all of his children, but to only one, and all the way down only to this group of people? This turns the concept of the chosen people on its head, because from what we understood in the Genesis, the promised land was to the chosen in the spiritual context as the descendants and followers of Abraham. God chose, but here we have only some of his descendants who are reinterpreting and saying that no, only we are the chosen, not our cousins, not our brothers, none of the others, only we are. Which in a sense is, if not blasphemous, at least it's a revisionism. That some of our Jewish brothers say that no, the reason that the land was promised to the Jews only is because God also made a covenant with Israel, with Jacob. But that does not preclude the agreement with Abraham. If it does, that means that God didn't know when God was making the covenant with Abraham, that this land is for your children, God didn't know that there's going to be Jacob, which kind of, not only in the context of a religious belief system, would be considered blasphemous, but logically doesn't make sense. God, by definition, ought to have known this. From the line of Ishmael, we have here the 12 princes. From the line of Esau, we have the 12 chieftains or the 12 kings. From the line of Jacob, we have the 12 tribes. So on the basis of what logic we are accepting only one group, but not the other? So if we consider these the chosen people, then we contradict the concept of chosen as chosen by God based on the Genesis. So this is a different chosen people. A superimposition of a human concept, obviously based on prejudice, to be superimposed on a totality. The next thing is the condition of the promised land. God's covenant promises of the land was conditional on her moral performance. Now, this is critical. Moral performance is not religious affiliation. That the details are both in the Old and in the New Testament. That, in fact, it also includes one of the warnings by Jesus, which we'll get in a minute. The promise was not made unconditional. Remember, Abraham stands for monotheism. Monotheism is the de facto recognition of one universal God. And if God, in that context, is making a promise, then the condition is the acceptance of that. And if you believe in one God, one universal God, not a tribal one, you have to treat all people fairly. And that treatment of everyone, regardless of their faith affiliation, falls within the context of morality, and therefore the moral performance would be a condition. In Jeremiah, which is very detailed, and I don't know if you need to spend time on that, but it is saying the same thing. And we also have another conditional promise that's explained here, that it's between God and Israel, that I explained before, is that it cannot preclude the other one. And here now we go to the New Testament, and this is Jesus, who also predicted that Jerusalem will be destroyed unless, to put it mildly, people behave themselves according to the norms and ethics that the divine had prescribed to them. And this one is from Luke 19, 41 to 44. There are contradictions between the biblical and the, I call it terrestrial, because on-the-ground reality is what I'm referring to. We cannot kind of trump or override a God while still claiming to be believing in him. This promise, the idea of the promise of the land, or the promised land, that is reinterpreted and misinterpreted. If you condition, as the Bible says, if you condition the granting of this land, the promise of the land, on behavior, that's one thing. But if you restrict it to a certain belief system, that's another. All these religious traditions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, these have evolved in the post-Abrahamic period. So in the time of Abraham, there were no Jews, there were no Muslims, there were no Christians. So therefore, that promise was not conditioned on them believing in any particular religion. They've all evolved subsequently. So if there is a subsequent, there's no deadline that, yeah, you believe if you agree with Moses, but don't if you agree with Jesus, or don't if you disagree or agree with Muhammad. We move on a little bit to a slightly different topic, but still relevant. That is from Genesis to genetics. If God is promising Abraham that his descendants, his children, his progeny is promised this land, then we come to a sidebar in history, and I'm talking about the Khazar connection. What I call, this is my terminology, the millennial identity crisis in Southeast Europe. The formation of states in Southeast Europe, that is the boundaries around the Black Sea, that will be the Black Sea over here, the Caspian Sea over here. The people who lived here, and you can see from the color that is quite a mosaic, when they came to form their states a little bit before the turn of the millennium of the Common Era, they realized that one of the ways that they could kind of boost their political image and their concepts of bragging right was, in addition to having a capital city and some sort of a ruler and some sort of a government, that they also had to have an official religion. So I'll give you 3 examples. And the interesting thing is that they went like, like shopping for religion, basically. The Russians sent 3 missions, one to Rome, one to Byzantium, and one to Baghdad, to find out about the virtues of Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, and Islam. And when the 3 missions came back, they told them what they saw in these lands. And the Russians were pretty convinced that Islam was the way to go. Vladimir is the ruler. He's kind of a co-ruler with his sister. And we are talking about the Kievan Rus, with the capital in Kiev. This is the second Russian state. And when they were just about to kind of finalize their decision that, okay, the Kievan Rus will be Muslim, the mission that came from the Muslim lands told them one reservation. It says, what? But these Muslims don't drink. And because drinking was so much part of life in Eastern Europe, they gave up on Islam. They went to the next one, which was Orthodox, and they adopted Orthodoxy as their religion. So here we have the Kievan Rus Empire here, and in the light brown and the dark brown is, of course, Byzantium, and the green is the Abbasid. And like I said, we are talking about before the turn of the millennium. And here is how that empire then expanded in the year 972. That's the Kievan Rus. Here is another one. If you have not heard of Kalmiaka, this is one of the modern day, it still exists as a republic. These people decided to go for Buddhism. Believe it or not, the only Buddhist state in the Upper Caucasus to this day is this republic. But of course, at that time, it was a state. And just to give you an idea, that is the size of Kalmykia. A very, very small state. They chose Buddhism. You know how you compete with the Joneses? Well, this is the mosaic, the ethnic mosaic of Northern Caucasus. And it's a lot more detailed. Now, the green is Kievan Rus, and the orange line, that is Empire of the Khazars. And the Khazars decided to go for what religion? Anybody wants to guess? For Judaism. Yeah, putting up with the Joneses. So 3 different states, we could say arbitrarily, but the point is that they were not really tied to any religious belief system, and they wanted to adopt one as a state religion, and that's how they win. So the Khazar Empire chose Judaism as its main religion, invited lots of rabbis, built synagogues, converted people, because once the rulers say, I'm Jewish, then that's the way things go. Over the course of time, this empire became very, very powerful, very big and very expansive. I think this is probably the height of it, and I think I should mention, since we do have some Persians here, does anybody know the name for the Caspian Sea in Persian or in Arabic? Yeah, it's called Khizr, but that is a Turkization in the context of the vowel harmony. That is the name of Khazar, because the Khazar Empire basically engulfed that whole region. And so then the name was just like we had to the south. Remember the Persian Gulf? Okay, and to the north, the Khazar Sea. So Khazar is not Khizr, the word for green in Arabic, that's a different interpretation. And the slight change in the pronunciation is due to the Turkish vowel harmony system. But it's exactly the name of the Khazar Empire. We call it Caspian for whatever reason. So again, now we're talking about in the context of this whole competitiveness. They realize that the Muslims identify themselves as the believers in one single God. So the motto for Muslims is, there's no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. And here is the Khazar version. This is called the Moses coin. And as you can see, it's written in Arabic. And it is pretty much identical to the Islamic motto of faith, except there is no God but God, and Moses is his messenger. Replacing Moses with Muhammad. So there they are again, very competitive in that context. Well, nothing lasts forever, and so the Khazars didn't last forever either. And here is where Poland expands to the south at the expense of the Khazars. And here is the extent of the Polish expansion. At this point, Poland becomes the largest country in all of Europe because they incorporated Khazar lands within it. So when the state collapsed, but the people still have the belief system, what do you think happened to the Khazars? The Khazars were Turkic people, were Turco-Altai by origin. So they came from northern part of China and Siberia. They're not even European. They are not Semitic. They are Turkic people, but they adopted the religion of Judaism. And this is not just a claim. And here are the names of the Khagan, which is the ruler or the rulership among the Khazars. In 618 to 628, the ruler is Tom Yabgu. In the 9th century, it's Bulan. And then we go to Obadiah, Zechariah, Manasseh, Benjamin, Aaron, Joseph, David. See the conversion of, or the adoption of religion. This happened to many of the Turkic tribes on the Muslim side as well. So, for instance, in Afghanistan, we had Tughrul, Alparslan, Supuktakin, and then the son becomes Mahmud and Mas'ud, and all of a sudden it is Arabized. So the same process goes on here. In other words, this is not just hearsay, but it's history, that these Turkic people became Jewish by faith. And in case we have any doubts, here are the looks. Depends on what part of their face or their attire you look at. They are equally Jewish and they are equally Turkic. These are the Khazars, ethnic Khazars in Jewish attire. Now, there comes a new concept. And that concept, which has been generally denied, is that we believe that Muslims could be of any nationality, could speak any language, but their faith unifies them. And we can say pretty much the same thing about Christianity, because these two religions are pretty universal. However, when it comes to Judaism, there are a lot of people who are in denial and saying that no, Jewish ethnicity, Jewish belief system is all one and the same. Not so, because of this critical element, that when you talk about whose land and the land being promised to the children of Abraham, then the Khazars are not the children of Abraham. And according to Friedman, 92% of the Jews of Eastern Europe, remember, when Khazar collapsed, its population became part of Poland, and then part of Ukraine, and then part of Russia. So Eastern European Jews are ethnically, genetically, based on, perhaps we could try a DNA test, they are not the descendants of Abraham. So if we are talking about the repatriation of the promised land to the rightful descendants of Abraham, what is it that we are really doing? How about the Palestinian Christians and Muslims? Yeah, they have a different religion, but exactly one of those same religions that came after Abraham, including Judaism. So we are taking the descendants of Abraham, kicking them out, and we are bringing the descendants of the Khazars and putting them there, and we are using the Bible as its justification. So if there is any concept of the return or repatriation to the ancestral land for the Khazars, it will be in Siberia, not in Palestine, logically speaking. So then we have to make that distinction that there is ethnic Jews versus Talmudic Jews, or people of the Talmudic faith. That in this case we understand that ethnically these people are not the descendants of Abraham, however they do believe in the Talmud, and therefore the belief system does not qualify them for anything that comes with the idea of the promise of the Holy Land. Let's move on to the second definition of Israel, and this is the Israel of the Zionists. And this one is a little too detailed, so I had a little trouble creating slides, so I'm just going to basically tell you how Zionism came into the foreground of European and American politics. That understanding the Jews suffering in Europe through the pogroms, through the Inquisition, and all that has been happening throughout centuries, and especially in Eastern Europe, and that element is lost on many, that the East European Slavs knew who the Jews were. So their discrimination that exists to this day in the open, in Russia, in Poland, in a lot of Eastern European countries, is based on two factors. That one would be based on a Christian belief system that, quote unquote, that the Jews killed Jesus and therefore they're subjected to one level of discrimination. On top of that comes another discrimination, that Eastern Europeans had this hatred of the Turco-Altaic people in general. And we are talking about from the time of Attila, on all the invasions that were happening from the east. And so the discrimination at two layers, at two levels. One is on the basis of their belief system, and the second one is on the basis of their ethnic origin, that they discriminated against Jews, and we are talking about the Talmudic Jews. There were countless pogroms, killing Jews by the hundreds and by the thousands, and wiping off villages and townships where the Talmudic Jews were the majority. So this already existed. So then, of course, in the rest of Europe, there was probably not the Turco-Altaic ethnic dimension, but certainly the religious part of it, that since the Inquisition that was going on. So the Jews had every right to respond to the Europeans saying that, look, if you guys are acting on the basis of quote-unquote national identity, that you can create for yourself a Catholic France and a Lutheran Germany and an Anglican England, we too should have that right. In other words, by declaring your state religion, you're excluding us from the citizenship. That's not our fault. So we do have the right to have a state of our own. Because that's how the Europeans were playing the game. But they didn't get much mileage out of that until World War I. And what happened in World War I was that it was primarily geared at the disintegration of the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires. But Germany was lumped into that because Germany was a recently integrated state, very dynamic, very progressive, and the British and the French and the Russians were pretty jealous of the Germans because the Germans were now replacing them in terms of their degree of progress and their hard work. The Americans were also sympathetic to the Germans because just like recently unified Germany, the United States was also a new country. And the United States was also working on similar basis that to be an American is that you can make it, you have the chance, you have the opportunity. There's no quote-unquote glass ceiling there. So when World War I began, Americans were very sympathetic to the Germans because they could also see that how they ganged upon Germany. In Europe, there was this other concept, which was creating a fifth column from within. That these wars dragged on for years and years. And if you look at the casualty numbers, it was just a slaughter that was kind of endless for, all over Europe. So one of the ways to defeat the enemy is to create a fifth column within that. So for instance, the Germans helped communists rebel against the Tsar in Russia, and so the Tsarist regime collapsed, which was a plan that the Germans did. That was the fifth column. They were also working on pretty much doing the same thing to using Armenians against the Ottomans, which unfortunately ended up in another big tragedy. And within 2 years after the start of World War I, Germany was victorious. The French army collapsed. The Italians gave up. The Russians were defeating, and England had only 1 week supplies. And that was the end of the whole thing. And not a single soldier had stepped onto the German territory. So, as Germany was winning, a group of Zionists under Untermeyer came to the British Foreign Office and said, and Germany offered peace to England. And before they accepted peace, the Zionists told the English Foreign Office that you don't have to accept the terms of this peace deal that the Germans are offering you, because we could do something, that is, by inviting the United States to fight on the side of England against Germany. Well, it sounded good, but who was going to do it? The Zionists then made calls across the Atlantic and convinced the Americans to enter the war. Until that time, the United States was not part of the war. And part of the work was done through our first judge of the Supreme Court, Brandeis, who was Jewish and Zionist. And then the conspiracy was made, like many of the conspiracies that has involved the United States in war. The Tonkin case, we know, the sinking, the explosion in the Spanish in the ship in Havana, or the more recent one. Remember the weapons of mass destruction, which are pure lies. So rumors were spread that the Germans have sunk the USS Sussex. And so Brandeis, the judge of the Supreme Court, goes to Woodrow Wilson, telling him that this gives you the right legally to consider that an act of war and declare war against Germany. Wilson goes to Congress, Congress declares war, And the Zionist group says, look, we did our part, now it's time to pay the bill. And the Foreign Office issues a letter, very vaguely stated, that Palestine would be given to the Jews, because that was the promise. Remember the promised land? There's a different version of it. The end result? That the winners and the losers switch sides and Germany is defeated. Then they went to the Versailles Conference, and of course the Germans have no idea of what is happening here. In the Versailles Conference, France and England imposed very, very heavy war reparation on Germany. They not only punished it, they destroyed Germany. But when this whole thing is happening, the German delegation sees that in addition to France, England, Germany, and all these, over in the corner sits a 117-member Zionist delegation. And they are saying, so what about Palestine? They wanted to make the granting of Palestine as part of the Versailles Conference. And that's when the Germans wake up that we have been betrayed. Germany realizes that it has been betrayed by their own Jews. But it is even more troubling for the Germans because many of the German Jews came from Eastern Europe. When they were persecuted in Eastern Europe, they found Germany the best land for them because they had the least amount of discrimination. So German Jews rose to prominence. They were among the millionaires and billionaires of their time. They had big corporations. There was no discrimination on the basis of religion. Why? Because we are talking about the land of not only Martin Luther, but also of Kant and Goethe and great German thinkers, to whom ideology was more prominent than religion. So if they discriminated against, at least during this period, their enemy number one was not Jews, but communists. Something that Hitler also built upon. And so therefore, there was no discrimination against Jews. And this continued, but of course the Germans felt that they were betrayed. And the end result is that World War II begins basically on the same notion. So in my view, World War I and World War II are just one war with a long intermission in between that started with Versailles. And so in World War II, then of course Palestine is given to, by one third party to another third party. If we leave the Zionist side of it in the European context to that of the Middle Eastern. In the Middle East, or actually anywhere outside of Europe, the state model that is based on the concept of integrationist theory. And the integrationist theory is an European concept that after they got rid of the Muslims in the south, they got rid of the Jews and they got rid of everyone else, and they got tired of fighting Catholics and Protestants, then they start fighting over nationalism. And nationalism in the European context is nothing but racism that is enforced through an assimilation of the minorities into the majorities' religion, language, etc., etc. In other words, they accept you if you become like them. And that's why most European countries are, in this context of integrationist theory and practice, are either all mostly Catholic or mostly Protestant. By contrast, in the Muslim lands or in India or in Africa, there's a whole mixture. So in the Middle East, there's not a single state that is exclusive for any one particular group, ethnic, religious, or otherwise. You can see it in Iraq, that the West just discovered that, oh my God, these are not Iraqis, but these are Shiis and Sunnis and Kurds and Turkmens and so on and so forth. That is the nature, because people have not been forced, assimilated into one quote-unquote national identity. So the European problem, where the Jews were excluded exactly because they were Jews, the remedy should have been in Europe, because European states are exclusive one thing or exclusive another. But that formula doesn't work in the Middle East. So when you create a state in the Middle East and say it's exclusive only to Jews, that creates a problem. And so this moves Israel from that biblical level, which has its own contradiction, to the Zionist level, and now we are moving to the third level, which would be the Imperial Israel. And what is a problem with the Imperial Israel is that most people do not know what the different layers of Israel or the different identities of Israel are and how they interact or contradict one another. Here are some of the conclusions that I have made, is that the formation of an exclusively Jewish state contradicts biblical injunctions. Next, Israel's two identities, as a democracy and a Jewish state, clash with the Western principle of the separation of church and state. Any other state that declares that this is an Islamic or Buddhist, whatever, the first objection from the West is you cannot combine the two. But in the case of Israel, we look the other way. 3, a one-state solution. Now I'm talking about the one and two-state solution that's mostly in the news. A one-state solution is in compliance with the regional model comprising of a multitude of nations, as the Bible says, as the reality on the ground says. So that's an ethnic mosaic. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing exclusive to anyone. The European integration model of forced assimilation and forced conversion of all citizens into the mold of the predominant ethnic, linguistic, or religious group in the name of nationalism does not work outside of Europe. Japan is probably the only exception, where, say, all Japanese are ethnically Japanese, but nowhere else in the world. Israel's role as a Western imperial outpost undermines any long-term coexistence and prosperity between Jews and Arabs in the region. If you're planting a tree and you want it to give fruit, you provide nutritious or nurturing soil, water, all the things that it needs to grow. You don't grow poison around the tree and expect it to grow. And the Jewish citizen of Israel who has the dream of the promised land to live in peace cannot get there because that dream has been hijacked by Israel being used as an imperial outpost to divide and conquer the rest of the Middle East. And so these are two contradicting concepts. They lump them together, and the minute you raise your voice, they either call you anti-Semitic or anti-this or anti-that. No. For the prosperity and welfare of the Jews in the long run, the way the state runs is not going to work. It has never worked anywhere in the world. If you go as a conqueror, we also know what happened to the Crusaders. Yes, they were successful. But if you go with peace, you stay in peace. But if you go with a sword, there are times that you get hurt by it yourself. Blowback concept. Western unconditional and unequivocal support for Israel without any accountability to the international norms stresses the fact that Israel is an imperial outpost. So you can deny it, but if you act upon it, that does not create an environment for peaceful coexistence. The West's claim of defending Israel against its enemies is a hoax for the following 3 reasons. Number 1, because Israel is militarily a regional superpower. Israel cannot be threatened. That's a fact. Number 2, because the West also arms all of Israel's neighbors to escalate conflicts. So if our idea is to make sure that Israel is defended, then why are we arming its neighbors? Perhaps with the exception of Syria. Every other country that surrounds Israel has weapons made in USA or maybe France or maybe England. The only difference is, to Israel's neighbors, we sell them to deplete their budgets. To Israel, we give them for free. But the final line is that we arm both sides. That is not conducive to peace. Number 3, Israel is immune to any nuclear attack from any Muslim state because of its size. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, the Israelis say that we are vulnerable because our state is so small that at its narrow point it's only 15 miles or 15 kilometers across. And the Arabs can just overrun us. Well, not only is that not possible in terms of the balance of power, but the fact that nobody talks about is that the nuclear threat to Israel is not implementable because the state is so small. Any state that decides, and let's suppose that they have the capacity, and let's suppose they are allowed, that they have the delivery system, rockets or whatever, to drop a nuclear bomb on Israel, before they kill any Jews, they would have killed thousands and thousands of non-Jews as well, Christians, Muslims, everyone. And do you think there's any quote-unquote Muslim leader that would have the stomach to do that? Because the nuclear radiation does not check for IDs. It kills indiscriminately. So this whole thing is just propaganda that Israel is being threatened by Iran. Israel, in the context of nuclear war, and I'm telling you here, it is impossible. Now, we are not talking about the capability of those states to do such, or the willingness to do so. Practically impossible. And so to conclude, I will go to my second Jewish source, which I promised you, and this is the surprise. I will go to my favorite, my most favorite Jewish scholar, Albert Einstein, who say the following on the Jewish state. In 1950, Einstein published the following statement on the question of Zionism. This speech was originally given to the National Labor Committee for Palestine in New York on April 17, 1938, but republished by Einstein after Israel's creation. The reference is Albert Einstein, Out of My Later Years, New York Philosophical Library, 1950. This is from page 263. I should much rather see reasonable agreement with the Arabs on the basis of living together in peace than the creation of a Jewish state. Apart from the practical considerations, my awareness of the essential nature of Judaism resists the idea of a Jewish state with borders, an army, and a measure of temporal power, no matter how modest. I am afraid of the inner damage Judaism will sustain, especially from the development of a narrow nationalism within our own ranks, against which we have already had to fight without a Jewish state. Albert Einstein was offered to be the president of Israel, and he rejected it, not because he was a genius in its own right, in its own time, but he was so far ahead of his time. I think the dilemma that the world faces today, and in my concept, there's a great betrayal of the Jewish cause, not the Zionist cause, of the Jewish cause, which has been entangled to world politics that, remember, the quote-unquote Jewish question has not disappeared. And we have made so many more enemies for Jews, and unfortunately, from among the people who treated them so nice throughout their whole history, I'm talking about the Muslims, that the first two prime ministers, Jewish prime ministers, came to power in Granada in a Muslim state at a time when they were being persecuted in Christian Europe. And if you go to Abrams, the former Prime Minister of Israel, he put it very clearly that the Jewish golden age was under the Muslims. And that golden age, that camaraderie, and more than that, when you look at the largest Jewish states before the formation of the State of Israel, were all on the Muslim side of the Christian-Muslim divide. Because every time they were persecuted, every time they were threatened, where did they have to run? They had to run to the Muslim land. That's how close they were. Now, that relationship has been destroyed by polarizing world politics, and in this context also, the Jewish dream of a peaceful return to the Promised Land has been politicized to a point of a very, very explosive and dangerous situation. I hope that our brothers and sisters in Judaism would have the wisdom, and I'm sure that many of them do. I have wonderful friends in the Jewish for Peace movement, and there are many others who are challenging this current crisis. It's not only explosive, but it's dangerous, because I told you that Israel itself has the immunity to the use of nuclear weapons by others, but the reverse may or may not be true. And we don't have to live through all these repeated attacks on whether it's southern Lebanon or the Gaza or whatever, because all it does is that it creates tension and animosity. And the Jewish people, in their thousands of years of history, they have suffered enough. They don't have to suffer anymore. They don't have to be dragged into somebody else's politics. So in my view, today's Israel is more than anything an imperial outpost for the West that is justified in the name of religion, for which they can't quote biblical sources because we saw what that meant. So I hope I have quenched your thirst, and I'm sorry that I had to rush some of the details here because of time. Thank you.